Everybody, I hope you had a wonderful lunch. I thought it was delicious. And we now have a double session dedicated to space and regulatory framework for space resources, which is so very, very important, the legal and regulatory framework for space resources. This first session is going to be led and chaired by Mahulena Hofmann from the University of Luxembourg. Welcome, Mahulena. And we have a fabulous set of speakers for both session 1 and session 2 after the coffee break. It is something that's deeply important. And of course, we heard Rosanna and Arti from UNOSA yesterday laying out how important it is. And so to dig into the details, Mahulena will lead this session with the first set of speakers. And of course, as always, we welcome questions from the audience. Mahulena.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mahulena Hoffmann. I am senior professor at the Faculty of Law at the University of Luxembourg. It is 65 years that Alan Shepard flew in outer space. Today we are in completely different situation. We are speaking about how to excavate space resources, how to use them in the outer space, how to bring them to the Earth, and how to use them. So today we are discussing the legal framework of space resources, and we are having a great privilege having with us Professor Steve Freeland. Steve, please, could you join us on the stage? So, Steve, you are not only Emeritus Professor of International Law at Western Sydney University, you are not only member of the Australian Agency Advisory Board, but you are the chair of the Working Group on Space Resources of UN-COPUOS. So you are the person the closest to the development of the future legal framework for space resources. So it's great honor having you with us, and we would be privileged if you could tell us what are the recent developments in this area. So you are coming directly from Vienna, full of knowledge and of expertise, so please give us your information.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mahulena. It's lovely to see you, and it's so great to be here. My sincere thanks to Esric, to the Luxembourg Space Agency, to LIST, to ESA, for making it possible to be here. I can't see you, and I only have one eye, and I can't see you. But yes, I've just returned from Vienna, where I've had the privilege of chairing, I think we had 11 meetings of the 110 countries of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I had the privilege of chairing, so that was about, golly, 14 or 15 hours of meetings, so that's a long time, where we were discussing many of the issues that arise from the activities that we're hearing about in this wonderful conference. Obviously, when we have lawyers on the stage, and we have an audience of people who want to achieve, who want to innovate, who want to create, who want to move ahead, there is sometimes a tendency to think that the lawyers get in the way. And that is not the case. It's certainly not the case when it comes to the possible future space resource activities. It's certainly not the case. Imagine this scenario just for a moment. Imagine a scenario where you have, let us say, 3 different groups of consortia of countries and corporations or whatever working together, but 3 separate groups in a relatively small geographic area, let us say on the moon, engaged in similar activities with a similar goal, that is, let us say, to access the water ice or whatever through whatever activity. So you have 3 different groups, and imagine if you had 3 different groups doing that in hazardous conditions with all of the incredible risks and technical challenges, and yet each of them were operating under a different set of rules. That is the stuff of miscalculations, of misunderstandings, and perhaps worse. That is the stuff where if there was an emergency situation, you would not have coordination and cooperation. That is the stuff where, rather than allowing those activities to continue, I mean, these might be competing groups, allowing them to continue and compete, you would have them actually being hampered and restricted because they don't have a level of understanding, a level of, let us say, certainty, although one can never be certain in such a hazardous location, but they don't have that level of certainty about how others will act vis-a-vis in relation to them. And so in that regard, I put it to you, and you may disagree, if we had no fundamental set of understandings, these are not restrictions, these are a level of understanding about coordination, about safety, about sharing important information and data, not confidential or proprietary information, but important things about hazards, about, dangers or whatever. If we didn't have that level of a basic understanding, then in fact the activities would be hampered. And so what is trying to be achieved at the international level is to try to have that fundamental understanding. And I know some of you will think, yes, but that means prohibitions, that means stopping me from what I'm doing. What it really means is it's enabling. It allows consortia, companies, countries, entrepreneurs to carry on their activity, as long as they're complying with fundamental principles, carry on with a level of comfort that they otherwise wouldn't have. It's a cliche, but if we didn't have those fundamental understandings, even if we're competing, then we would have to create them to allow that to go on. Now, I don't know whether you find that a convincing argument, but that is the thinking behind the processes of developing principles, rules of the road that build upon existing legal principles that will allow and enable the possible future activities that you're also incredibly passionate about to actually move forward in a systematic, in a safe, in a sustainable, in a peaceful, in a rational way. That's quite a compelling set of are they adjectives? Yes, adjectives. That's quite a compelling set of adjectives that you, as companies, as scientists, as engineers, as entrepreneurs, where you're devoting your energies, your money, your capital, your time, you need to be able to see that these activities can be facilitated in that way. But space resources is just such a wonderful area. It's not just about innovation and engineering and science. It's not just about having rules of the road. It's also about culture, and it's about exploration, and it's about trying to work out where do humans fit in the greater ecosystem of space. Are we, for example, to think of space purely in rapacious terms, as something that we just take from? And of course, space resources is, to a certain degree, exploiting resources. But if we can set a tone for exploiting those resources in a rational way, with peaceful purposes in mind, maximizing benefits, minimizing risks, you will never eliminate risk, then I think we are enabling this to move forward in a proper way. So very briefly, there is already a lot of law, hard law, if you like, through the treaty framework that is relevant for space resource activities, although it's not expressly referred to apart from one treaty, my favorite treaty, but it's one that's not subscribed to by many of the countries who are at the forefront of space resource activities. But the Outer Space Treaty, which you've all heard of, has fundamental principles about cooperation, about peacefulness, about not putting weapons, about having due regard, having a feeling for what others are doing, to try to work out in an ecosystem, even if we compete, that we can compete in a rational way. So we have an existing set of laws. The international community, and so who is the international community? I heard yesterday that there are 35 countries represented in the room here. COPOS, the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, is 110 countries. All of the 35 in the room, plus many more, and that number grows every year. And that number includes every country you can think of that would have a stake in possible future space resource activity. So you have the United States and India and Russia and China and Japan and Canada and the United Kingdom, and the list goes on. But you also have other countries in the room who come with different perspectives, who are, some call them developing countries, although that's not an expression that the United States uses anymore, but others do. These are emerging spacefaring nations. The legal framework we have for space is that everybody has a stake in what goes on. That's not to deprive those that actually go and do these things, but it's to reinforce this idea that this is, to a certain degree, something that we all have a stake in, so that those that do move forward do it in a way that, as I said, rational, sustainable. That's not to deny them the possibility down the track of making money, of course. Nobody denies that. But there are a whole lot of other factors. Remember, it's not just about commerce, it's about culture, it's about science, it's about who we are. And so those 110 countries, including those that support many of the private industries that are in the room, have all said, let us have a basic level of additional understandings. It'll be non-binding, but still, if the process is there that they've all contributed, then that encourages compliance. Let's have this fundamental level of understandings over and above the legal framework that will allow us to carry on, compete if we must, but carry on in a way that gives us the greatest level of possibilities. Because there are so many challenges. There are so many challenges, and the legal framework and principles that we're putting together are there to allow us to address those challenges, not to be sitting on the sidelines thinking about other things, you know, the possibility of conflict, the possibility that I have to use, I don't know, military force to protect what I'm doing. So this process is continuing. We've had multiple meetings, the countries are engaged, they're very engaged. The commercial sector is represented by these countries. The United States, and it's just one country, the United Kingdom, have both made it clear that from their perspective, these activities need to be driven by their private sector. In fact, the UK has said the UK won't be engaging in these activities unless the private sector can do it. So it's not to exclude. There are, of course, other countries in the room that have different perspectives, and my job as having the honor of chairing these discussions is to find that common convergence, to allow us to get forward. Humanity has made the decision that this is something we want to do. You are devoting your incredible talents and energy and expertise in taking that to the next level. You know, I've just heard incredible things in the last day and a half, and I'm sure there is more to come. But understand that it is important to have a fundamental understanding of those principles that will allow you to continue to do that. So the principles, the 110 countries graciously asked me to prepare a first draft of these principles. Remember, they're going to be non-binding, but a process is there. I did that, I circulated it to them in March of last year. We've had about 30 plus meetings together. We're negotiating it. This is a public process. Everything is on the record. You can find the latest draft, which was just put up on the website with the incredible support of Rosanna and a team at uni.lu just a week ago. So we've made incredible progress. They have now said to me, okay, you, Stephen, you've heard what all of us want. And of course, there are different perspectives. I will now take all of that, distill it down into a consolidated version. That version will be translated into all of the official UN languages. And if we had time, there'd be a quiz as to you telling me what the 6 languages are. That will be available publicly in September, and then we continue the process. The mandate of the working group that I had the honour of chairing ends in 2027, and our goal is to finalise these principles. They are termed an initial set of recommended principles. Initial. This is going to be an iterative process. These principles will be relatively high level because we're still, despite all the incredible innovation that's going on, we're still at a relatively formative stage. We don't know what space resource activities will really look like to a large degree. You know, we still are in that stage of trying to work out what's real. We know we need to understand fundamental ideas about safety and peaceful purposes and compliance with law and sharing data and cooperation and all of those things. But we can't be too specific now because things will change. And so we're creating an iterative process. Hopefully these principles will be agreed in 2027. That's the mandate end. So it's up to me to herd these 110 countries into agreeing the final words. And then we take it from there. Part of the mandate of this working group is, once we've done that, is for the member states, the 110 countries, and next year it'll probably be 115 because it grows all the time, to work out what is next. What do they need next? And that will be driven largely by what you are doing and what becomes feasible over what time spans. So this process is working with all of those innovations. It's not there to block. It's important, obviously, that there is a set of understandings. It's important to encourage responsible, sustainable, rational behaviour. It's important to call out behaviour that falls way below that standard. But the intention here is not to restrict. The intention is to enable, but enable in a way that allows this and our future as a humanity and our place in the space ecosystem to be done in a rational way for your children, for your children's children, and if you take the thinking of the Indigenous people in my country, Australia, for 7+ generations forward. If you think about what you're doing, and to a small degree what I'm doing, as pioneering work for 7+ generations going forward, then that's an incredible responsibility, but also an incredible opportunity. And, you know, I think we are all of a common mindset there. So my hope is that my brief words, and we've got some wonderful speakers afterwards, encourage you to sit down with the legal people, but also sit down with the legal people and the cultural people and the scientists and the economists and the policy people and and we can together sort of take this forward. But it will be important to have a set of principles and a set of understandings upon which we can all work. So with that, I sound like this has been a bit of a pep talk rather than an informative talk. I apologise, but I hope you take away what I've said and it's been helpful. And later, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you, and thank you, Mahulena.
Thank you, Steve, please stay. Thank you for the perfect analysis of the situation, which should prevent the chaotic situation when the space resources activities really come to existence. So there will be a specific Q&A session afterwards, but perhaps we have time for 1 or 2 questions from the floor. Are there any? Yes, please. Here is the gentleman. We are waiting for the microphone. Jim, please,
Hi.
could you introduce yourself?
Yes, hello, Jim Caravalla, Off-World. Hey, Stephen, lovely to see you, and thanks for the great comments. Just a quick question of clarification. If you recall, the Hague Working Group came up with a set of principles in the last decade. What do you think are the most significant or notable differences with this exercise? What's the extra layer of values that are being added around that?
Shall I answer? Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Thank you for your question. So this is a conversation, you know, space resources generally, that excites all levels of society. And civil society, academia, you know, NGOs, think tanks have been very much engaged. And so Jim's referring to a group of, I think, 30 academics and industry people who together looked at this issue and came up with what they thought might be interesting rules of the road. That's, you know, my job is to take all of these inputs, and those inputs were presented through the Netherlands particularly, because they come in through governments. But we've got the Artemis Accords as another input. We've got ILRS inputs. We've got, you know, developing country inputs. It's like a box of marbles. And, you know, we shake those marbles around. We've got the treaties. We've got this treaty, the Moon Agreement, the one I referred to at the beginning. All of those are inputs. And so the Hague Working Group is another input. But the Hague Working Group was 30 academics, really good people. I mean, I know most of them. But we are now at a multilateral level where every country engaged in this is involved in deciding this. And so, of course, they will look at all of these marbles as we work towards a final agreement. So it is an input, but, you know, we are at the multilateral global level where countries have the opportunity to contribute and therefore are much more likely to comply, irrespective of whether it's binding or not. You know, that's very different from a small group from civil society coming up with, you know, some academic rules, as good as they are, but it's a totally different process.
So if I may, I was participating in this Hague working group, and it was the focus on safety zones, for instance. Perhaps there is another question from the floor. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Delane Mayer. I'm a professor at New York University. I teach a course on the geopolitics of outer space. I'm curious what emerging economies are asking for in terms of benefit sharing or access other than use of Earth observation data, for example, but with regards to space resources specifically. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful question. So this is a UN process, right? UN has, and the COPOS has countries from all levels of economic development. And so, and separately, within the UN discussions, not just in space, there's a strong push by countries led by some within the G77 group, really pushing for equitable sharing of benefits generally in the UN system. And so obviously that debate also comes in the space debate. And, you know, benefits is a really interesting discussion, a term. It's not defined. In the principles, obviously we have to have a balanced document. And so there will be reference to the possibility on a voluntary basis, mutually agreed, you know, all of that stuff, of a sharing, the possibility, it's not mandatory, of a sharing of benefits, but benefits can mean so many things, from sharing of data and information to capacity building, to technology transfer, to maybe sharing of samples, you know, to cross-fertilization of scientific personnel. You know, benefits means so many things. Some people have this idea that benefits must mean monetary compensation, and I understand that for many is a bit of a red rag to a bull. But I don't think anyone in the room disagrees with the notion that as we develop these activities, we gain more knowledge. And the more that that knowledge is understood, the better it is for humanity, and perhaps the better it will be for future activities. So the sharing of knowledge, capacity building, helping others is something that, you know, countries do not disagree with. I think, though, the disagreement would be if you made it mandatory and if you stipulated that it would include, let's say, monetary. As I said, it's up to country. You know, they will have to agree the words in the principles, but largely it'll be up to them how they do it. But I think everybody recognises that there are, pardon me for saying it, benefits in sharing the benefits to a certain degree, but you can work out what that might look like. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Steve. I hope you will be here in the Q&A session as well. So thank you so much also for answering the question. And with that, I would like to invite Alexandra Ruiz Castillo. We have a representative of the young generation. Alexandra, you are coming from the University of Oxford. And Alexandra, you are going to speak about the governance in space resources activities. So we are very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here and share a little bit, because this is just a fraction of the research that I conducted last year, and I'm very pleased to share with everyone. So thank you so much. I'm just gonna stand over here. Well, it's not easy to take the floor after such insightful interventions, but I will try to build on them. So, as I said, over the last year, my research has focused on two closely related questions. First, how space resource governance are taking shape in practice today? And more specifically, what kind of patterns can we observe in the way states are positioning themselves? Here, it is important to say that I am not here to propose an ideal legal framework or to assess what the law ought to be. I am here, my dissertation was more about examining how the governance is being constructed in practice and how we are constructing it through the diplomatic, as we just heard from Dr. Freeland, in the diplomatic, in the legal, and in the regulatory framework. This is very important. So, the study draws on the limited corpus of 47 primary documents. Among of them, we were talking about these draft principles. I took 20 national responses to the Corpus Legal Subcommittee Working Group questionnaire. Different countries, different positions, different interventions of different countries, 17 state contributions to the draft principles. I also look at it, 4 different countries which have dedicated a space, national space resources law. This is the United States, Luxembourg, of course, the United Arab Emirates, and Japan. I also took into account key treaties, the Outer Space Treaty, as well as the Moon Agreement, key frameworks that we were already introducing to you as the Artemis Accords and the Hague Building Blocks, and of course, the draft principles, the last year draft principles, mainly March and July 2025. Here, it is important to say and to clarify that all these sources are not taken as equivalent in the legal framework, in the legal status. They are completely different. They are analyzed more as different sites where governance, space resource governance, is being expressed, justified, and operationalized. Also, using a mixed methods approach, combining qualitative coding and pattern identification, the research basically tried to examine whether recurrent patterns of governance are emerging across these materials. So, according to the data, what we can see is that actually positions do not converge uniformly. They are separate, they are basically 2 different patterns, they are 2 different tracks in the way states are positioning themselves. And I want to remind you here that we are not only looking at how they are presenting themselves into the United Nations, in Corpus, how they are expressing themselves internally, nationally, and as well as the relationship with other countries. So all of these layers is what actually we are looking at. So, these 2 patterns, in the first pattern, we can see how activities are being constructed. There is a growing alignment on how these activities are being conducted today. And in the second pattern, we see a continued differentiation on aspects, for example, who controls the resources, or who might claim rights over the extracted materials, or actually what we were just mentioning, how benefits should be shared, right? So to understand better all these patterns, as I mentioned, let's dive into the first one. The first one is what I call the procedural coordination. All these elements, there are certain elements that appear consistently across the national submissions, the diplomatic discussions, also the normative frameworks. All these elements, transparency, consultation, the regard, sustainability, are elements of procedural elements. And what it says is basically they are creating the structure in how space resource governance are being conducted, all right? And this is very important because actually the relationship between these procedural elements is what is giving us coordination and predictability without having to require an agreement on the more political sensitive questions of allocation. So, in the second pattern, what we can see here is actually when the analysis turns into ownership, into resource rights, into benefit sharing, what we see is that the positions, the state positions, remain fundamentally differentiated. These issues, and this is very important, these issues are not absent. They are being discussed. Just as we hear from Dr. Freeland, they are being actively negotiated. But the truth is that they do not align in the same way than the procedural elements. It is also important to recognize that all these elements that we are seeing here, they are much harder to translate into consistent regulatory and operational frameworks. Let's go to the second pattern. Oops. Was it? No, here we go. So here we have the whole snapshot. This is, when we look at governance layers, we can see clearer this pattern that I'm talking about. Basically, when we analyze the national legislations, we can see already that the strongest articulation goes into authorization, supervision, and legal certainty. When we look at multilateral negotiations, the emphasis shifts toward transparency, consultation, and due rigor. And when we talk about normative frameworks, then we see how they are elaborating or further elaborating into coordination principles and sustainability. But in each of these layers, allocation remains differentiated. Ownership models, allocation, institutional control, all these elements, they do not align in the same way. So, what this reveals? Well, it's not just a list of different positions of different countries saying different things. It's not at all that. This is actually more profound. This reveals a structured relationship between the areas of alignment and the areas of differentiation. Basically, procedural convergence pattern is providing actually a shared base for cooperation, while the distributed differentiation is just capturing those areas in which there is persistent disagreement. So the strengthening of these findings is actually in the fact that this is not found only in one single document. It's not found in one single setting. This pattern is found around all the layers that we were analyzing in the dissertation. And this is basically the recurrence of these patterns across the data. So, perhaps the question is no longer if states agree or disagree in benefit sharing, or if states agree or disagree in ownership. I think that there is one more question, one more analytical question that we have to ask ourselves, and it's basically whether if governance is being constructed in a way that can continue despite the absence on agreement on allocation, or if whether ultimately is still required for the framework to remain legitimate. And that's actually the question that I would like to leave with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexandra, for presenting us your main thoughts. With the view on the watch, one question from the floor, please. Yeah. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yep, I will. Yeah. Hello. Yes, Clive Neal, space lawyer in training. I'm intrigued by your question, because allocation in the national laws seems to be quite well settled. And you concluded that it's not. Can you expand upon that, please?
Yes. Basically, allocation refers to all these elements that what I was explaining about benefit sharing, about how countries have still different perspective about these elements that are not aligning in the same way. So all of this is what we consider not the allocation that is not settled yet. And this is important to say, this is a snapshot. I am not here presenting how is the future of space governance. This is just what we are seeing in the discussions right now, that there are still some countries having in different perspectives on what I call allocation, that is all these elements that are effectively the benefit sharing, institutional control, resource rights. All these things are the allocations that are a little bit more political sensitive questions. And this is, well, what we are seeing today. And we are not talking about actually what is gonna be. It's just the future. I think with help of the amazing job that Corpus is doing, we are gonna see further development of this framework. But yeah, this is what I refer for. I hope I answer your question.
Thank you, Alexandra. You passed the defense of your doctoral thesis at the moment. Thank you for your presentation, and we are having you in the Q&A session.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to invite Günes Ünüvar to the floor. Günes, you are coming from the University of Exeter, and you are specializing in international space law, space security, and also international investment, and you are author of many interesting articles and also the books at the moment. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mahulena, and hello, everyone. Okay, this is the clicker. So I am indeed freshly a senior lecturer in law at the University of Exeter. In addition to that, I'm the legal advisor of the Moon Village Association, and through their permanent observer status at the UN COPUOS, I also get to have the privilege of actually attending the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, including legal subcommittee, which took place a couple of weeks ago. So it's obviously nowhere near as cool as Stephen's task, but I also get to sit as an observer in the room. And it is essentially during those repeated visits to the legal subcommittee in particular, and the work that is brilliantly being orchestrated by Stephen, steered by his expertise, that certain issues stood out to me. I'm going to talk about basically one of those issues, specifically the status of scientific and, broadly speaking, non-scientific activities, space resource activities. The way that the debate is ongoing right now, those non-scientific activities, even though they're broader than just commercial activities, very much converge upon commercial activities that pertain to space resource activities. The reason why this is an outstanding issue is, of course, the now very complicated, multi-layered number of actors and interests that are at play. Traditionally, space law, international space law is very state-centric, even though it sort of carries on that feature to some extent. This very event and its growing audience is testament to this increased divergence of different actors. Among them are commercial actors, of course. And as different interests, different stakes come into play, certain areas such as scientific activities and regions that are interesting and important for scientific activities are also faced with additional, sometimes commercial interests coming into play. One good example is, as is obvious to many of you, of course, is the South Pole and the permanently shadowed regions and the famous water ice that is locked in those regions. This is one example, of course. There are many different scientific sites that are of significant interest, as they're called nowadays, but I think this is a good example, and maybe building on Stephen's example of what happens when three different actors go to the South Pole, to one of those permanently shadowed craters, and they want to extract that water. One of them, let's say, is a scientific expedition. The other one is a commercial entity that wants to extract it, purify it, and use it for their base, right, mining operation. And let's say the third one is ILRS, right? So what happens? There are different stakes at play. Who gets to go there and extract it first? This is a very relevant question. And unsurprisingly, this is a question that has been addressed with the first draft of the Working Group on Space Resource Activities. So how do we sequence those activities? This is essentially the question here. I won't really go too much into the legal framework. I just wanted to, for the sake of completeness, show it. Outer Space Treaty is, I think, is known to many of you. It is essentially the constitution of international space law. It enshrines the principle of freedom of exploration and use, the prohibition of non-appropriation principle, that space is province of humankind, that its use and exploration should benefit all humanity, in a nutshell. So we also see something interesting in the Outer Space Treaty, that the one type of activity that's actually mentioned in the treaty is scientific activities. There is no mention of commercial activities, for example, which obviously does not mean that commercial activities are not accommodated within the international space law framework. That, I think, would be a very unpopular opinion, especially in this crowd. But it's important to note that, because it was actually the argument by some states, that it's mentioned specifically, therefore it must have a specific importance compared to other types of activities. And in the context of current negotiations with the working group and the principles, these initial draft principles, specifically under Article 6, the initial draft that was circulated in March 2025 actually was titled Prioritization of Scientific Space Resource Activities. I'm paraphrasing, but prioritization was in there. I think after 11 drafts that have been iteratively uploaded on the website, now we are at the point on 28th of April, we have the latest version where this prioritization language appears to have disappeared. And it's been replaced by due regard regarding to scientific activities. Going back to the initial debate, the supporters of this prioritization language, which of course they have many reasons to support that, some political, some with a genuine interest in scientific pursuit perhaps, but the supporters of this particular language argue that science is expressly mentioned in the Outer Space Treaty, so it must have a specific importance, special importance vis-a-vis, for example, commercial activities. Therefore, they argued that indeed science should take priority if it comes into some sort of conflict with a commercial activity. The critics, or rather those who did not want that prioritization language, essentially said that, well, the treaty is from 1960s. It is an overarching treaty, but obviously it was not foreseen back then that commercial activities would pick up, let alone conducted by private entities. Therefore, the treaty's silence is not necessarily so powerful that it gives priority to scientific activities per se. So it's not there's no intention to subordinate future private activity to scientific activity, so to speak. So as I said, the priority language has sort of shifted towards due regard, which basically says, again, I'm paraphrasing, but this is online, so you can have a look at it. That says that scientific activities should be accorded due regard. Scientific activities and space resource activities that support these scientific activities. And now it says these activities should be accorded or extended due regard. And it was a 4-paragraph text, much shorter than what it is today. And since this prioritization focus seems to have shifted, the nature of this principle seems to have shifted as well. This really complements well what Stephen has said earlier, giving the overview, and actually what Alexandra said, and it wasn't planned at all. It is true that there's a very difficult situation where consensus, this uniform consensus, as she very eloquently put, it sort of branched out into different ways. Now we see certain counterweighing factors in this principle where future spacefaring nations or developing nations have inserted in there certain safeguards as to how scientific activities can be concretely emphasized in the face of this imminent commercial use and exploration by spacefaring nations. This can be done through information sharing. This can be done through sharing of scientific data that is extracted from these space resource activities. There is even a paragraph that mentions there can also be voluntary sharing of samples, for example. So it really encapsulates much broadly than what the prioritization language have foreseen, that science is important and there are ways that we can use science, scientific activities, to cooperate and to foster further dialogue. It's important, I think, especially because this is an iterative process. This is a process that will evolve. It will change, it will become more concrete as we go forward. So I think the current framework really captures that Vienna spirit, as they say, this consensus that might hopefully take over eventually. Now, of course, one final thought is that what is really a scientific activity as opposed to a non-scientific activity, and is it even accurate in the current landscape of different possible prospective activities? Can you really say that something is definitively a scientific activity and not really a scientific activity? What if a private entity, a for-profit entity, conducts scientific work, which is not only possible, it's the reality today. So how do you really sequence that anyway in the context of this prioritization framework? Prioritization means categorization. Categorization means definitions. And if you want to define things in such an extent, then you have to be really, really assertive and really precise in how you designate what a scientific activity is, who conducts it, and what a primarily scientific activity is, for example. And also public actors can pursue strategic and commercial goals, right? This is also not excluded. These are not mutually exclusive considerations. So I think the due regard language, perhaps it can be worded differently, but the direction that this due regard language, this due regard discourse takes us is more conducive to the current state of scientific activities, commercial activities, and the ways in which they can blend in the future. Thank you very much.
Günes, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. The question I see already.
Thank you very much. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. This is an amazing presentation. I wanted to get your thought perspectives on the bifurcation of the various treaties and agreements, specifically China and Russia not signing the Artemis Accords and them developing their own lunar platforms, own lunar landing programs. And how does this create a possibly volatile situation where enforcement might not be possible? And some of these are realities we need to address before commercialization and big money actually flows in, because the chances of it escalating when stakes are high is even higher. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. I think that I'll basically refer to what Stephen said earlier and build upon that, that this process is precisely to prevent future conflicts and worse things that might happen. I think the problem would be that in the absence of processes like this, these multilateral processes, that we should perhaps be more wary of potential frictions. What is really unique for me, especially in the past decade or so, when you had this very sensationalized Artemis versus ILRS differences, for the first time on a state level, we have these actors in the same room, and in my observation is they're doing so, they're engaging with one another in a very constructive, in a very civilized manner. So I am even more convinced that we need those multilateral processes, and we should actually sort of fight against, in a way, the language that sort of tries to discard or delegitimize these multilateral processes, may be pursued or somewhat encouraged by other unilateral means. Of course, it's not going to make everyone 100% happy, but I think that's within the nature of consensus. And if we have some degree of consensus, then that's where we reach the least likely situation where a conflict might occur. Will it completely render conflict unlikely, impossible? No, of course not. That's not the real politik today. Conflict is always possible, but I think the goal, the aim should be to minimize the risk of friction in the presence of agreed upon legitimate operational rules that the international community should be building?
Thank you. Thank you for answering this question. I would like to postpone the others for the question and answers session after the panel. Thank you, Günes. And by that, I would like to invite Mr. Jordan Stone from the Imperial College London. Jordan, you are researcher working in planetary defense and space resources, and you have chosen a subject of planetary defense. So we are very much curious what you are going to share with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mahulena. Yeah, hi, I'm Jordan. I just finished my PhD at Imperial College London, focusing on planetary science. So I did some stuff on planetary defense as well. And I'm now working at a research nonprofit on mainly like forecasting stuff for the future. Yeah. So my talk is going to be on synergies between planetary defense and asteroid mining. And I'll try and propose some regulatory stuff that we can do about that as well. So it's quite clear that planetary defense and asteroid mining have lots of adjacent capabilities, or they benefit from the same capabilities. So planetary defense is protecting Earth from asteroids, and so detecting and tracking near-Earth asteroids is a very important part of planetary defense, but it's also the case that it's very important for asteroid mining. So the planetary defense community has been tracking and detecting near-Earth asteroids for a very long time, and there's quite a good data set now that the asteroid mining community is also using. Characterization and physical compositional properties of asteroids is also very important for planetary defense in terms of planning any deflection missions that we might need to do, and also for defining which asteroids might be the most hazardous if they were to impact Earth, like the metallic ones, basically just punch through our atmosphere much more easily than a rubble pile asteroid or one that's made mostly of silicates. And then operating spacecraft in proximity to small bodies is going to be very important for asteroid mining, but also for planetary defense. We had the DART mission, which was intentionally crashing a probe into an asteroid to test deflection missions. And asteroid mining and planetary defense also benefit from the same missions. I have my favorite ones up here, Hayabusa 2 and OSIRIS-REx for sample return missions, and the Psyche mission is going to the metal-rich asteroid Psyche, which, yeah, it's benefiting all of us. I should also have the DART and HERO missions up on here too, where the DART mission crashed into an asteroid on purpose, and the HERO mission will now go up to the asteroid again and get more data on its internal properties, which is going to be useful for everyone. Okay, so more specifically, what does planetary defense give mining? So the main thing is just detecting and tracking all of these near-Earth asteroids. So there's a catalog of the different asteroids that you can go and mine. And quite interestingly, I think planetary defense and asteroid mining are interested in the same asteroids, the ones that are closest to Earth in their orbits, the easiest to get to, but then also most likely to hit us. And also the metallic asteroids are most interesting to asteroid mining and also to planetary defense because they're the most hazardous. And so yeah, there's a great data set now of all of that information and the same technological heritage, orbit modification concepts, which were developed in planetary defense and might be used in the future in asteroid mining, and asteroid detection and tracking and characterization. But I think this is going to change in the future. I think mining is going to give a lot to planetary defense, whereas at the moment I think mining has gained more from planetary defense than the other way around. So there's only detailed physical data on a handful of near-Earth asteroids, and for planning any deflection missions, we need to have a much richer data set. And I think commercial activities are going to be able to get characterization data on much more asteroids than planetary defense can. And so, yeah, there's going to generate data on mass, density, composition, spin rate. All of this data is really useful for modeling any deflection missions that we might want to do in the future in planetary defense. But it won't all be sunshine and rainbows, because obviously this is data that is collected by commercial actors, and so you don't necessarily want to just sell it for free. So there's going to be some near-term operational friction. I think mining ejecta and untracked debris is going to be one thing. Some of these asteroids come extremely close to Earth. So this is Apophis, and you can see the geostationary, the satellites in geostationary orbit and how close it comes to those. And so interacting with this asteroid, producing debris or junk might like pose a threat to satellites. And close approach data or just like characterization data is going to be like valuable to planetary defense. So like who gets that information, especially if it's useful for safety. And then I think there's a longer term structural tension, which is that like asteroid mining they're planning to go to asteroids that come near Earth. And so if you're messing with these asteroids, I think that there is a risk of accidentally or like incidentally altering their orbits. So like for an example, if you're mining an asteroid, you only care about like a tiny percentage of the material. And so if you're refining the asteroid material, you're just ejecting the rest into space, presumably. And that's now propulsion force on an asteroid that is quite close to Earth. And so just for like context, the planetary defense community defines an asteroid as a potentially hazardous asteroid if it comes within 0.05 astronomical units of Earth. Astroforge went to go and mine an asteroid that was 0.007 astronomical units from Earth, so like an order of magnitude closer. And then in the future, I think we're going to be like intentionally altering asteroids to put them in orbit around the Earth or around the Moon. So I think regulation should be proportional to the hazard. I think if you're mining an asteroid that's like pretty far away, then you don't need to worry about any regulatory interference. Same thing is like, I think every mission is going to be different. Maybe some are going to be creating more risks than others. So the core problem, I think, is the uncertainty about how to handle the areas of overlap. What do we do with this data? What do we do if there's like a potential risk that needs to be looked into? So my proposal is like turning transparency into an asset. So sharing operational data contributes to planetary safety. So companies that report transparently, this happens naturally. You build trust, reduce liability exposure by helping with the safety and help write the standards that will govern the industry. So at the moment, like SpaceX, for example, is helping a lot with tracking satellites for collision avoidance. And that helps them like support the industry and also gain power in the industry. And help build like foundational bodies for data sharing that work for industry rather than just for governments. And I think these should be led by industry. So companies that share data and report transparently and like participate in collaborative frameworks that help protect Earth from asteroids gain lighter oversight and faster approvals. I think like we can actually design a framework that happens like that. And the companies that succeed in the space industry are the ones that like benefit the Earth and benefit the economy by sharing like this data. And so the regulatory friction could be said to be graduated. So there are like levels that you can get like lighter regulation over time. So this is a way that is like, I think transparency is kind of like a burden on companies at the moment, but if you actually reward it with like faster approvals and lighter oversight, then you actually get an environment that is like good behavior is sort of incentivized. And I don't think that's the default that happens, and it can be designed now. So like the preconditions for enforcement are patchy, they don't really exist as an overall framework at the moment in space. And the desired behavior are like what kind of things do we want to reward in the space sector is largely unspecified. And I think it's good to have these like conversations now. So in practice, what this looks like is things like voluntary data sharing agreements between mining companies and ION. This is the International Asteroid Warning Network. So this is a network of observatories around the world who collect data on where asteroids are and whether or not they might impact Earth. And so like having those agreements between planetary defense and asteroid mining companies would be great to like keep that data up to speed on the actual knowledge on where the asteroids are. I think there should be some mechanisms for handling proprietary data. Maybe, I think it's necessary that any proprietary data really has to be shared. I think there are some things that were just like, yeah, I might have like altered this orbit of this asteroid, or I might have created some dust or junk that might be hazardous. And then just having those frameworks to like connect asteroid mining and planetary defense so that this data can be shared properly. Standardized and clear reporting as well for orbital perturbations or commercial asteroid interactions. I think this matters a little bit in the near term, but then like a lot in the future. And dual use mission planning and funding as well. So if you're doing a mission to an asteroid that is near Earth, then governments who are interested in planetary defense should also be interested in that and should fund those kinds of missions. And so to put things into like a timeline, in the near term, asteroid mining is going to generate new data. That's going to be great for asteroid characterization, not just for like science in general, but for planetary defense. And then industry-led dual-purpose missions, I think, is something that we should really try to push for. I think that there are going to be some minor issues coming up, especially with asteroids that come really close to Earth, like Apophis, where minor dust and junk generation. So that see, I've almost like sort of red highlight where some satellites might be at risk, where it's like these dust particles coming off asteroids would be traveling at like such high speeds that they would just destroy satellites if they were to impact them. And then later on, I think you'll get incidental asteroid orbital alterations, not just from like processing, but also like accidental collisions with asteroids if that were to happen, and a range of like other subtle ways that these can build up over time. And then I think, you get intentional asteroid orbital alterations in the future. So I think at that point, you're going to want some really close connections between planetary defense and asteroid mining when you're actually like intentionally altering the orbits of asteroids. I put increasing friction at the bottom there, but I think that you could also write this as increasing collaboration over time. So to summarize, just support industry-led transparency standards, engage with the planetary defense community as partners, so dual-use missions, and also like attending conferences like Asteroid Day in Luxembourg in June, and treating data as a shared asset. So planetary defense collaborations are a pathway to a future with proactive, graduated, industry-led standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan, for sharing with us your thoughts about this really new field. One question from the floor, please.
Hi.
Yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm Anna from the Asteroid Foundation. Cheers to Asteroid Day. Thank you for mentioning it. My question would be, so I saw the timeline in terms of increasing friction, but do you have any dates in mind?
I don't have any dates in mind, I'm afraid. I think that obviously the activities are going to speed up in the 2030s. I think that's when many companies are planning on speeding up their activities. In terms of like intentional orbit alteration stuff, I think naturally we're achieving like 2040s to 2050s. But like the organization I work for is looking into transformative AI technologies, and I do think that like the standard timelines are wrong. Things are going to speed up quite a lot, which might explain some of my earlier, or thinking about things that might happen in the future a bit earlier than you might want to.
Thank you so much, and please be with us for the section on Q&A in the end of the panel. Thank you for your presentation. And last but not least, I would like to invite Kamil Muzyka from the Polish Academy of Sciences. Kamil, you are specialized in space law with a focus on space resources ownership and manufacturing. And you are also author of several books and articles on this subject. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good day, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about today I'm going to talk about the problem of the ownership of space products, or exactly what are space products, how can we categorize them, and what do we lack in space law. Well, first of all, we learn that we can be granted ownership of extracted space resources under one of those 4 national acts of space law. We are granted ownership, the right to use, sell, transport, and so on. But okay, what if we use or sell those space resources? What do we sell them for? What they are made into? They're made into products of space manufacturing. I have categorized them in two camps. The first one is the space products. Those are the basic tools, basic like elements, something that you can use on the station or sell on the surface of the Earth. but there are also space manufactured objects. Many of you who actually read some older works on space law and space resources, some stemming from the 1960s space industrialization, may recall the large construction and base construction. Even here, many here present their startups that are going to manufacture whole factories, whole installations in outer space. So the space-made object is something akin to a space law on space object, which is naturally launched from the surface of the Earth, but a space-manufactured object is a similar purpose device, a similar purpose object, but it's manufactured in situ with the use of space resources. Okay. But what do we first need to know? First, we need to know that we don't have a clear path towards authorization of space resource activities and also in space manufacturing. I don't mean that we don't have national laws that claim that, oh, you need to, you can get authorized for space mining activities and so on. No. What I mean is the problem that we don't have the full story. Like, we don't know what type of authorization and what type of rules will be settled by by our appropriate state, the authorizing party. For example, will it be a laissez-faire approach where everyone who gets authorized for space mining can also be the manufacturer and also sell their products to anyone, anywhere, whatever, whoever, for whatever amount, and it will be a bonanza? Or will it be a micromanagement style, like for example with commercial remote sensing, that would require you to file and report every kind of activity to the administrators of the Earth. So it would be a very, very difficult task. And also, this involves the issues of national security, export control. For example, if you would produce an element that could be used for a dual-use space technology, can you actually sell it? Or the bigger fact, is the national authorizing body even going to tell you what you can and cannot produce with those space resources? But we need to take into account that space law doesn't actually regulate outer space. It's a regulatory umbilical that connects terrestrial nations to their space appendages, to their space objects, which are also their quasi-territory. And thus, every space activity on the moon and in cislunar space will be anchored towards terrestrial interests of spacefaring nations. So yes, this looks exactly like you see. These are the appendages sprouting from the nations of the Earth. Not exactly nations here, but as you can see, this is how you should view space activities. Space activities don't exist without space objects, and those space objects conducting those space activities are in fact the effectors of national space policy. As in space law, this is a national space activity. You need to take that into account. So anyway, we also lack some issues, some clarification over the ownership under space law and civil law. We need to take into account that space law, civil law, and commerce law uses the same terms to describe for like jurisdiction and ownership, but they mean completely different things. The term ownership in the Outer Space Treaty doesn't relate exactly to private ownership, but the registration and the belonging of a space object to a nation. But we don't have time to discuss the Astronaut Rescue Treaty that further describes this. Also, the limitations on ownership. You need to take into account that, for example, as I said, you can have limits on those, on the ownership. Like for example, you might be ordered to reserve some of your space resources or products for the US Space Force or any other national space force in that regard. And also the terms of license might impact your ownership and what you would be able to do, who can you be able to sell it to. Also, you need to take into account that we don't have a category for in-space manufactured products. Will they be considered space objects or SMO? Also, in my conceptual idea, or there would be a new unseen category of objects in space law, because we need to have regulations over this, because, well, things cannot get lost or stolen. Anyway, also space resource activities, especially further down the line, and this is things that we need to understand, will be subjected to even more regulations than we ever imagined, but also this comes from the government involvement, which is crucial for national security, and national security involves not only the national security, but also fighting away like space pirates. If you have read the Taylor and Feldman book, The Space Piracy, or even James Cambias, The Corsair, you know what space piracy is. It's mainly cyber piracy, hybrid warfare, free doctrines warfare, or war by other means. And also, you can there is the issue of export control and involvement of this in the ISM and SRA field. But remember that standards are a lifesaver for the for space operations. You don't want substandard parts in your space equipment. So that is also a thing. But also, what do we require? What do we require as space mining operators, as manufacturers and other operators? We do require an intergovernmental regulation on space commerce, something like a clarifications of international private international space law. First of all, and that which would not include a hyperlexis, which is a so-called American disease, but the ISS IGA would be a better framework to be used than the Artemis Accords, in my opinion. Also, the post-extraction framework for adapting national laws and better recognize ownership of space resources, the commercial application or the commercialization of space resources, and also the recognition of space manufactured products and objects, and rethinking the idea of space objects for a more sustainable use, especially in the field of space debris. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamil, for explaining this very important part of national and international space law. One question from the floor. Yes, please.
Hi, I had a question.
I can see
over here
you.
in the back.
Okay.
Puneet Sani from ESRIC. I had a question about patents, because you're talking about manufacturing. Correct me if I'm wrong, patents are territorial. When we go about manufacturing in space, how do we deal with patents? Especially if we deal with creating something novel in space, how do we patent it?
Okay, patenting depends on where you are trying to apply for a patent. That's different procedures, although they are mostly harmonized. But then again, you have the issue that patents are protected territorially. And if you have a space object registered, the operations within this space object do fall under the patent jurisdiction, the territoriality, unless you're Australian, because Australia doesn't protect patents, doesn't apply patent protection to its space objects. Or, for example, Poland doesn't also have applied patent protection for its space objects. Like the general general idea of Article 8 and jurisdiction applies, but national laws decide where the patent law is applied. So it applies only within the confines of the space object. It doesn't apply extraterritorial. Well, it applies extraterritorially on a different space object, but I will have to explain it to you later. But anyway, it doesn't apply beyond the confines of the space object, even though the 2019's UAE space law clearly states that IP applies outside also, or in the vicinity of the space object. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamil, for mentioning also the Polish space law, which just recently entered into force. It's very important. So thank you for your presentation. May I ask all the presenters to come to the stage for the Q&A session? So now the floor is open for your questions, please. Yes, please, there is one.
So just a quick one for Kamil. If I land a spacecraft, I've got a licensing permit to fly a spacecraft, land it on the lunar surface. The spacecraft remains my property as an object. If I land a spacecraft that sinters the regolith around me to make a landing pad, in your hypothesis and thesis, what's the ownership status of the landing pad?
Well, I would say that according to, for example, civil law, commerce law, and common law, it would apply to you that you actually create a product using those space resources, even if it's just a symphony of the regolith. But we all know that there would be benefaction before or that, because regolith is ununiform. But yes, it would be your product. But then again, we hit the problem of space law and the problem of non-appropriation. But if you get a license for that, if you get a license for actually doing this, your country is responsible for your activities. And if you didn't get a license to sinter this regolith and create a launch pad, your country is still responsible for your activities. It's not only liability, it's responsibility.
Fair enough. And just one final point. One final point there. Then, if I'm not claiming ownership of territory, just the pad, then the non-appropriation issue doesn't arise.
Yes.
Good.
Okay, thank you. Another question, please.
Yes.
Could you please introduce yourself?
I'm working on it. There we go. Clive Neal, University of Notre Dame. Question for Günes. Moon Village Association, when they put their sites of special scientific interest out there, I found that to be very divisive. And I did not like the prioritization and the elevation of one community over another. So you made my blood boil when you started your presentation. And right at the end, that last bullet, I went, they've changed their mind a little bit here, because the whole point of these principles is universal buy-in. And you start elevating a community, one community over another, you create division. And it's exactly what we don't need right now. And so my question to you is, has that position of the MVA mellowed a little bit? And because when we go to the moon, we go together. We all go together. Science goes with commercial, goes with exploration as equal partners, because then you maximize the benefits. So I just want a clarification of where the Moon Village stands about this sites of special scientific interest. I'm a lunar scientist.
Right.
But I disagree with elevating science above everything else.
So my presentation was, of course, in my personal capacity, but I think also I'm not directly involved with Friends of SSSI. This is the initiative you're referring to, I think. And there are multiple stakeholders. MVA is only a part of it. COSPAR is a part of it. IAA is a part of it. So it's a consortium of sorts. Still, I think my reading is a little bit different than yours in the sense that it's not an absolute elevation, but it's rather an emphasis on the importance of science in the context of space activities, which in certain cases might manifest by giving a leeway or giving permission for scientific activities to take precedence over other things. So it's because there are very specific circumstances in which conducting science in pristine conditions is extremely important to the science that is being conducted. That's my understanding, at least. But it may be different than the MVA position, perhaps. But my reading isn't that it's a categorical prioritization in every case. But maybe we can discuss this during the. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Other questions from the floor?
Right here.
Yes, please.
Hi.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Alexandra Lingle. I'm a systems and hardware enabling engineer for Intel. It's an honor to be here, by the way. Normally, the people from Intel don't get to come to a conference like this. I go to many conferences, but this is one that's very unique and special in my heart. As you know, in the past, historically, in the Wild West expansion of the United States, there was something called the race of the stakes, where people went horseback to claim a stake in the ground, to pick up the stake and claim it at the government to pay taxes for that property. Is there anything like that happening in a discussion of this lunar expansion and presence? And is there a talk of any kind of global tax that benefits all nations, that even the ones that haven't signed up for the Artemis Accords? I was just wondering if that's been in the ether sphere of your conversations or if there's consideration for that.
Who would like to comment? Kamil, please.
Okay, first of all, the Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty was purposefully designed in order to prohibit any attempts of homesteading, meaning that you don't pack a wagon train and go there, claim your land. Even the Great Mining Act of 1872, if we are talking in American terms, isn't even an appropriate instrument here. Here, if you actually have to discuss space operations, you have to imagine that even a space station which is being lodged into a lava tube or being fused within the ground is considered the same way as an RV or any other camper car you can assume, because all space objects are by definition mobile. Mobile meaning they cannot create real estate. Even though they are technically fused within the ground, they cannot be the basis of real estate and claims of sovereignty. But on the same note, I have to say there is a form of a ledger, like the Open Lunar Society proposes the lunar ledger for the operations, so everybody could register their operation, so it won't be first come, first serve, but in all actuality, when you look at the Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, and I don't know if you're versed in science fiction, but there was the book by Kim Stanley Robinson, The Red Moon, where actually the People's Republic of China used Article 9's avoiding harmful interference clause in order to inhibit American expansion on the moon.
Thank you. Professor Freeland, would you like to comment?
Thank you. It was difficult to hear the question, but I heard the words Wild West, and that always, raises the hairs in the back of my head. People talk about the Wild West of space because it suits them to talk about the Wild West of space. That in no way reflects the reality, and there's lots of law, and we won't. There's no need to go through all of that. But the reality is we're moving in, technology is allowing us to do more and more things. Technology is allowing you to consider extracting utilizing, exploiting the resources. That was not really contemplated early on. There is a treaty that deals with it, but that treaty essentially said, okay, when it becomes feasible, we'll have to put in place some ideas about how we do that in a rational manner, and that's exactly what's happening now. So there's lots of law. We need this foundational basis, but we also have to be pragmatic and practical because the technology is allowing. You know, I've heard in the room at the UN, and it's a negotiating tactic, you know, one recognizes that, but there have been countries saying, well, if we can't agree on these principles, we're going to go ahead anyway. These things will happen, and maybe there are some people in the room who would also say that. And so it's important that we, you know, and I think a theme of all of the talks have been we sort of maximize benefits, whatever that might mean, minimize risks. You minimize risks by having an understanding about how this works. If you go for the opposite, you know, there's no rules, it's a free-for-all, first one there, sticks their, you know, stick their flag in and that's it. One, you're being contrary to international law. Two, there'll be massive opprobrium throughout the international community and nobody will trust that person. And three, it is not possible. It is not possible for one consortium to control all of this. You know, this is so big and so complex that in the end, we'll need to find a way. Even if we compete with each other, we'll need to find a way that we can coordinate. And so, but people will still talk about Wild West because it suits them to say that, but it really is completely opposite to what the reality is, I think.
May I add a question? Is there any ambition to transform these recommendatory rules into a proposal of a binding document?
So, as I mentioned, thank you, Mahulena. As I mentioned, the principles, I mean, they can be whatever the member states want, the 110 countries, all the decisions are theirs, but they have agreed, not universally at the beginning, but now they have, that whatever we decide will be non-binding. Now, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing because if you have, as Clive said in his question, a buy-in by everybody, then whether it's binding or non-binding, they have, you know, there's far more likelihood of compliance anyway, rather than trying to impose something. Various countries, and I can quote the United States, but it's not only them, say it is far too early to try to have prescriptive binding rules. I mean, we already have law, you know, the Outer Space Treaty, but binding rules specifically on space resource activities because we don't know what they look like yet. It's far too early. And I think that's a logical argument. Some will disagree with it. But we are going to have an iterative approach. And who knows, Mahulena, part of the mandate of the working group will be decide what's next after we get the principles done. What's next? And they may decide that, okay, we're now at a point 5 years from now that we need something of a more binding nature. It may or may not happen. This is not a treaty-creating world that we live in any sphere, let alone something as sensitive as space resources. But, you know, in the end, it may well happen, but certainly not at the moment.
Just very quickly to what your question about the Wild West. I mean, the term Wild West really creates the impression that it's lawless. It isn't lawless. There is obviously a very foundational framework. I also, my apologies, but I also disagree that space law does not regulate outer space. Of course it does, of course. I mean, our national laws might be the tether, but they must comply with international law. By definition, this is regulation. This is regulating it. So maybe it was meant in a different way, but outer space law regulates outer space. Everything has to comply with it. The second thing, to what Stephen said about Mahulena's question, actually, that's an interesting remark was made during the legal subcommittee. I won't name the delegation, but they said something very insightful they said that this might be a binding agreement, it must be a non-binding agreement. We might say shall, we might say should, but if at the end we're not going to comply with those rules, what even is the point? Why are we here? If we don't show the good faith to comply with what we have discussed and debated and negotiated, and all this effort went into this, why are we even here? If this is performative at the end, and from now on this is my my words, if it's performative in the end, what is the point indeed? And it makes you think about what a binding law means, what soft law means, what it implies. And if soft law finds its character, its nature in a national law in a binding sense, then I think soft law would have done its job. So in a way, we need to legitimize these processes so that we can actually have tangible rules with which stakeholders can comply with without really choking the innovation and their drive to continue conducting these activities.
Alexandra, I would like to ask you, in your work, did you search inspiration also in other areas of international law, like in telecommunication law or in maritime law?
Yes, thank you for the question. Definitely, there are several legislations we can draw actual inspiration from. The Arctic we can just see, but it's true that space resources are so specific, and as Dr. Freeland just mentioned, this is such a new environment that we are exploring. The research basically says that we are constructed to the illegal. I think that the lawyers are going to understand here is not only through the legal framework, but also to the state practice. States are carrying activities, they are carrying missions, and everything is being conducted in both sides. And I think this is what we are seeing. We are in the process of trying to construct this legal framework through negotiations very actively at the UN, but also through the national legislations the countries are constructed. And of course, all the negotiations that are being carried out between the countries, between the enterprises, the private sector. So I think this is a very particular area, and that's why we can take inspiration from those other frameworks that we have constructed as to regulate other areas of human commons. But this is true that space resources is very, very specific.
Thank you for this answer. And I have also a question to Jordan. In your work, I have not heard the word registration. So you were speaking about the exchange of information between the two categories of space activities. But where should the information be placed? Are you thinking about the creation of an international registry, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a good point. So there actually exists already an international registry that holds all the data about where the near-Earth asteroids are, with all the data, like their perihelion, their size, those sorts of things. I think the Center for Near-Earth Object Studies holds that registry. So yeah, my proposal would be that asteroid mining companies contribute towards that. And the way to do that would be through interaction with the International Asteroid Warning Network, which is a network of observatories, space agencies around the world who contribute data towards this information on where the asteroids are, and tracking them and monitoring them, that sort of thing.
Thank you. Kamil, you wanted to react to one of the questions.
No, I wanted to clarify to my friend here that I didn't have time to discuss the idea that space law is basically a regulation of space activities of terrestrial nations and humans in outer space, and therefore it is a very, very, very geocentric. And that is why I say it doesn't regulate space per se, the same like you had meta law. The primary concept of a space law, where it was like a communion between humans and extraterrestrials, and creating boundaries like we have the sea law, or like we are terrestrial nations, but we operate on the sea and everybody can enter the sea. We all have our lands and so on, and territorial waters. And in the same way, I would like to see the future of space law as being non-geocentric, but actually broadening the human rights and even community rights in outer space, but But that would actually mean that we would have to abandon some of those principles, like for example the non-appropriation principle, because at the same time the UN Charter gives you the right to your land. Like, you must have a right to your land.
Thank you. So, have you overseen anyone raising a question? We are blinded, so it's a bit difficult. There is a question, please.
Oh. Hi. Sorry, another one. Jim Caravella again. Look, thanks for all of these comments. And Stephen in particular, thank you for all the work you're doing on behalf of this Committee for Space Resources with the UN. It's extraordinary leadership. I know it's a heavy responsibility. And I'm very grateful for you to driving that effort. So I'm going to raise some concerns that I have. My concern is that we have one stakeholder group that's defining the narrative of the conversation, the space law community, in many ways defining that. And some may argue that they certainly have a mandate to set the framing for the stage. My concern is, and we've had this discussion a little bit before. My concern is that the framing is coming from a starting position that somehow, if the interests of humanity, the principles of equanimity for all, and the benefits of prosperity for all humankind were not mandated by the space law community, then none of those stakeholders would be represented by the actors who are actually going out there on that frontier to try and open up that and make change. I find that extraordinarily disheartening and even disingenuous, in that I know in my heart the outcomes and the objectives and the interests of all the people alive today and the future generations, not just the 7 generations, but all the generations ahead of us, are relying on us making the very best decisions in this generation, where we have this critical moment in time where the moon is untouched. The moon remains practically untouched by humanity, and by the end of our generation could be in a process of almost urbanization and industrialization. So I agree, I think we share the same sentiments that this is an extraordinarily important time. But what I really find of concern is that there is almost this self-proclaimed mandate by the space law community to set law. And I'm saying that very specifically because I know it sounds obvious. That's the community that leads the effort. But I do think that the other stakeholders are not just, let's say, we're not just contributors to that conversation. We are, all of us, part of that conversation. And that's why when you said that the Hague Working Group effort on space law, on the guidelines, resources, was 30-some academics doing some isolated effort. I would describe it much more like this was a 4 to 5 year multi-stakeholder effort that was torturous in its effort to make sure everyone was heard, that all communities were engaged from all around the world, from all different sectors, and it was a very rich effort. So I just want to say that as we go through this effort, as you're driving that process, don't forget that the space law community is one of many communities, including economic, climate, the prosperity of the people, all sorts of stakeholder interests are prevalent on us making the right decisions and enabling us to go forward in this generation.
May I quickly
Please,
respond?
I
Do we
can
have another
imagine
question? Yeah.
that you would like to react.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jim, with the greatest respect, you misunderstand the process. Firstly, it's not the space law community. I mean, it's not a cabal of lawyers making these decisions. We have 110 countries. Each of those are governments. Each of those have delegations that are lawyers, diplomats, science, engineers, weather forecasters. You know, they are there to represent all of the stakeholders in their country. Of course, there are also permanent observers at COPOS, 50 of them. They can't make decisions, but they contribute to the discussions. So, you know, I think you mischaracterize, you make it sound like it's a closed room of lawyers. It is anything but that. The process is not perfect. Completely, we all agree with that. Every voice should be heard. Again, you mischaracterized what I said about the Hague Working Group. You know, it wasn't disparaging. I said their inputs are important, but it's an input into a broader process, which is not 30 people from 10 countries or 12 countries. It's 110 countries represented in the room. Those views are important, but so are the views of Zimbabwe and Costa Rica and United States. And, you know, so it's a broader process. It's not perfect. It's not perfect. But there isn't a better process if we're talking about something, given the nature of space, that if we get it wrong in space, the whole world suffers. Everybody suffers, right? So we're completely agreed that there are stakeholders concerned. But in the end, if you're not happy with the process, go and speak to your government, because they are there representing you. It may not be perfect, but you know, be part of the US delegation or whatever delegation you choose. You know, put yourself there, because Clive's there as part of the delegation. He's not a lawyer, and he was just recently there in legal subcommittee. So it's a broader process than you say, but it's by no means perfect. I apologize, but I really had to react.
So I think that this exchange of views perfectly show how important this session is. And by that, I would like to thank all the participants of this panel. Please be here also at the end of the second legal panel. I think that similar questions will be raised, and I am sure that the people would like to see you also answering their further questions. So thank you so much for this wonderful panel. It was great pleasure listening to you. Thank you so much.